Right, this is the next in the series of Ogham mini tutorials covering this time Saille, which is the fourth letter of the alphabet. Where are we? There we go. So it's this one here. Get my thumb out of it, finger even. So that is Saille, which is actually the fourth letter, which is where it has the four flesh, the four little twigs, the four little marks. And you can also see there, hopefully if I'll put that forward a little bit, that's the letter S, or the equivalent of the letter S in the English alphabet at any rate. So we're just running through a few of the connected ideas that are linked to Saille. In terms of what Saille means, the word translates as willow tree. There's a variety of different species of willow, quite a lot of different types of willow, but mainly we're probably looking at goat willow and crack willow as the commonest types, given that the weeping willow is a relatively recent introduction to this country, coming over from China, Asia in general. It's only been here a few hundred years, which is long enough for us to get used to it. But in terms of early Celtic lore, it wouldn't have been part of that. Now, the weeping willow is much associated with grief and sorrow, and the whole idea of those drooping branches looking kind of rather mournful. So there are some elements of that that come, excuse me, comes out with this symbolism. But there's the emphasis on the willow in poetry, kind of more recent forms of poetry from the last few hundred years, emphasising grief and sorrow and the idea perhaps of some bereaved lover mourning over the death of their boyfriend, girlfriend, what have you. That's more influenced by the imagery associated with the weeping willow from China than it is from the earlier types of willow. That's what I'm trying to say. So we'll go over some of the imagery associated. First off, I've mentioned it's the fourth letter, so in terms of numerological imagery and number imagery, the letter 4 in Gaelic myth, primarily in sort of Welsh, Cornish, etc. in general, you can associate it with the four major provinces of Ireland. In early times, there were 5 main provinces of Ireland, but the 5th was a very small one, the central one of Meath, which was a more kind of administrative centre than it was what you'd call a big tribal provincial area. So even then, it was still the 4 main ones plus the central administrative one. So you could associate the number 4 with the 4 divisions of Ireland, linking that obviously to the 4 directions of the compass, north, east, south, and west, as an image of the world, of stability, of all things summarised and brought together. So that there's elements of that comes out in it. In terms of the bird imagery associated with the Saille, we have Sibach, excuse me, the hawk. And the hawk is crops up a little bit in Irish myth. It's one of the shapes that Fintan and various other figures take during these prolonged periods of shape-shifting, in which the story goes that initially Fintan arrived in Ireland with 2 other guys and 150 women. A bit of a comical touch to the story, as some of you at least will be aware of, in that the women take the 3 men as their husbands. But it's got to be a kind of a polyandrous setup, because obviously there's only 3 men and 150 women. So 50 wives per man. The first man dies of exhaustion, I'd imagine, and then the 150 women are split between the 2 survivors. And then the second man dies of exhaustion, and the surviving man, Fintan, thinks, 150 women, I'm going to be shagged to death or something. Can't cope with the prospect of it, and runs off. Kezer, the queen of the people, is so grief-stricken. Her father's died, her friends and lovers have died or run off. Just the kind of grief and horror of it, and the prospect, I suppose, that the 150 women will just grow old and die, and there'll be no children, no offspring, etc. No surviving population is just too much, and she dies. And as she dies, floods break over the land of Ireland, which is quite small at this junction in the story, and drowns all of the women. And Fintan himself only survives because he shapeshifts into a salmon, and he swims in the floodwaters for ludicrous amounts of time. And then eventually the floodwaters recede, and when they recede, the land mass of Ireland has got a little bigger. More of it has emerged from the floodwaters than was there beforehand. Throat. As the waters recede, obviously the salmon is flopping about in the mud and transforms into a hawk, got there eventually, and sits in the branches of a tree, watching the land dry out and kind of be reclaimed from the oceans, and watches the next wave of people arrive and spends centuries in the shape of a hawk, and occasionally talks to people and dispenses historical lore and wisdom to them. So the hawk becomes a symbol of the memory of the land, as well as an image perhaps of survival. But you could also, obviously, you have the whole hawk-eyed imagery associated with that bird, that is very far-seeing, has fantastic eyesight. So Fintan, in bird shape, sees through history. He sees the flow of time and remembers it all and passes on this perspective to whoever he's talking to. And you can certainly see that. I'm thinking of a recent discussion around the unmentionable B word, and all of the intense emotions that are whipped up both for and against at the moment when it comes to Brexit. A recent discussion kind of said, well, in the grand scheme of things, give it 100 years, 500 years, not only will all of the people involved at the moment be long since dead, but will whoever it is of humanity that's around in 500 years' time, will they give a monkeys about Brexit? Will it all be just some distant, vague, passing memory that school kids are forced to learn in history classes and bored to death with, and all of the passions and the intensity of it will be as far distant to them as the passions and intensity of the English Civil War are to us today in the 21st century, a far-off thing that we read about but don't get excited about in the same way that people at the time did. And you could say that is perhaps the quality, the trait of the hawk's memory. It sees the big picture, the comings and the goings, the struggles, the dramas of everyday life. It sees it, but sees them all in the perspective of vast memory, that even the most dramatic incident will be lost in the sweep of time. And it puts everything into a kind of perspective, a bit like gazing up at the stars and realising how insignificant you are. You're this tiny little grain of human experience in this eons old cosmos. There's an element of that. So I suppose if you were engaging in a divinatory reading and Saille came up, you could say, well, this individual perhaps needs a dose of that perspective. Maybe their own problems are seeming so overwhelming, so intense, so dramatic. They need to take a step back and think, well, 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 100 years' time, well, in 100 years' time, no one will care, but in 10 years' time, if they themselves are still alive, will the things that seem so intense to them now seem at all significant in 10 years' time? And perhaps the answer to that question will be no. Sort of sad cases spring to mind of you occasionally hear about teenagers who've been dumped by their girlfriend or boyfriend and go and commit suicide because what seems such an overwhelming thing when they're 16 or they're 17 and they end their life because they can't imagine ever being loved by anyone ever again. You think, for those who don't commit suicide, for those who go on to live into their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and have assorted love affairs in the future, that drama of the broken romance when they were 16 in the perspective of the passage of life and of time loses its intensity. And when they are 30 or 40 or 50, they perhaps look back on their 16-year-old self and think, why on earth was I so close to chucking myself off a bridge over that spotty twit? Because at the time they didn't seem like a spotty twit, obviously, is the answer to that. But in the passage of time, things take on a perspective. And so in a divinatory reading, it could be that sense of whatever is overwhelming you at the moment. Try to bear in mind that from the perspective of the hawk, with its memory of the passage of time, it will become a triviality in due course. It's not as big in the grand perspective of things as it feels at the moment, as a suggestion. Sometimes we mention the trade or professions Ogham, because each of these letters is, as well as birds and colours and whatnot, associated with careers, but we don't mention it for every one of these podcasts because some of them are very obscure and no one's quite sure what they really mean, and it doesn't really lead us anywhere. But for this one, for Saille, it's sheshat, which is the right, like a smith, basically. There is another one later on, which we'll get to in due course, which is specifically a blacksmith, an iron worker. So this is not specifically an iron worker, it's the idea of a smith, a right in general, someone who makes stuff, whatever that stuff may be, whether that's silversmithing or bronze smithing or iron smithing or a wheelwright or a barrel maker or what have you, someone who is good with their hands, an artificer, a creator, a maker of things. And so there is a sort of an undertone of creativity. So perhaps if you were doing a reading to give somebody career advice, then maybe telling them to consider arts and crafts and something creative and hands-on and practical and making stuff would be an advisable one to go down, and the kind of the capacity to shape the world. Colour-wise, the colour of them, we've got surach, which is fine-coloured, which is obviously not something that exists in modern English as a definition of colour. So what on earth does fine-coloured mean? It could perhaps refer to maybe like a sandy colour, the kind of fine, very pale, almost beigey colour of something very faded that's so fine it's hard to quite define what it is. And that would, as a suggestion, if we go down that sort of slightly beigey route, fit well with two of the word Oghams. So of the three word Oghams, we've got hue of the lifeless, colour of a lifeless one, and activity of bees. Now obviously the hue of the lifeless and colour of the lifeless one, colour of the corpse basically, very pale, very wan, very faded. Fine seems an odd choice of word, but something that's faded away almost to nothing. So there's a sense of fadedness there, perhaps. Sorath, the idea of faded colours, doesn't really crop up in surviving stories. So you get lots of stories about people in red cloaks and black hoods and other quite strong, intense colours. Very rarely does it refer to anyone wearing colours that are faded and fine and kind of hardly there at all. There may have been stories in which it was more prominent as colour imagery, but those stories perhaps haven't survived the passage of time. Now going back a little bit, we mentioned the Gaelic myth with the hawk. Although the Ogham is not, does appear in areas of Wales, but it's areas of Wales where Irish people settled. So the Welsh people themselves were not particularly using the Ogham, so tend to focus on the Irish rather than the Welsh. But we do have the Welsh stories of Gwalchafed or Gwalchmai, which are worth mentioning. And Gwalchmai and Gwalchafed are two names for the same character. One of the loyal warriors of King Arthur, who in later times becomes known as Gawain. So that's the kind of the earlier versions of the name Gwalchafed or Gwalchmai. Gwalchmai means the hawk of May, the month of May, and Gwalchafed is the hawk of summer. So in both cases he's still a hawk, and it's roughly the same time of year, May or summer, Calamai or Beltane if you prefer from the Irish side. A very loyal, very devoted, very fierce warrior who's very committed to his friend King Arthur. One particular interesting story worth flagging up, there's something to mull over, is that Gawain, in his more medieval version of him, is a prominent character in the story of Gawain, obviously, and the Green Knight, in which a huge, great, shaggy, hairy, weird-looking man comes to the court of King Arthur and says, "I will put a challenge to the king. I will take my huge, great axe here and give it to one of you, and you can chop off my head. And then next year I'll come back and chop your head off, if you're brave enough to go through with it." And everyone thinks he's a bit of a nutter, I suppose. And the king is about to put his own head on the block to put this strange giant to the test. Well, I say put his own head on the block, take the axe and put the giant's head on the block in the short term, his own head on the block in the long term. But Gawain jumps up and says, "No, no, my liege. This should be a job for one of your minions, for me, not for yourself to put yourself in the line of risk." Because Gawain obviously is thinking this guy is either completely deranged or there's something magical going on here, and of course we know it's something magical. So the giant puts his head on the block and Gawain chops it off, and then the giant stands up, picks up his own severed head, puts it under his arm, says, "Thank you very much, see you next year," and off he goes. And everyone thinks, oops, wasn't expecting that. Long story short, Gawain goes off on a long, long adventure to try and find the court of this strange, scruffy giant. And after about a year's worth of travelling, he still can't find it, but he does come to a court and he thinks, well, I'll see if I can stay here the night and get something to eat and drink and what have you, as I continue the journey searching for the scruffy giant. So he goes in and there's the lord of the manor and his wife. And the Lord of Man welcomes him in and says, "Oh, you must stay and have something to eat, something to drink, etc. As part of your sojourn here and stay a few days, then each day I like to go out hunting and fishing and what have you. I will bring back my catch and share it with you. What I catch, you will catch, and what I have, you will have. And in exchange, whilst you're resting up at the court and doing whatever you're doing, when I come back at the end of the day, you give me what you get." And so it goes on like that for a few days. So each evening the knight comes back and says, "Oh, I caught these birds or these hares or whatever it was," and shares some with Gawain. I said, "Thank you very much." And Gawain, who's spent his day doing knightly things, so if he wins a bit of money at gambling, he shares that with the host. And the wife is not quite as chaste as she might be, or at least if she is chaste, she is often caught. And she starts getting a bit fruity with Gawain and gives him the occasional peck on the cheek. And so in a slightly blokey, embarrassed fashion, Gawain gives the host a peck on the cheek, saying, "Well, I got kissed today, so here's your share of the kissing, as it were." I wouldn't read anything too much into that. It is just kind of medieval humour, I suppose. Towards the end of the story, the wife says, "Well, I know you're about to go off and meet this terrible giant and all sorts of things are going to happen to you. So I will give you this magic girdle, and if you put this magic girdle on, you will survive getting your head chopped off. It will, you'll be okay." And he takes that along with a kiss. And on that last night, the host rides back in, shares the capture of his hunting, and says, "Well, what did you get today?" And Gawain gives him a kiss, but does not give him the girdle, because obviously he's thinking, well, this is the thing that's going to keep me alive. And so suddenly the nice, polished, well-dressed host reveals, ta-da, that he is actually the big scruffy giant. And this has all been a bit of a con. And he says, "Right, it's a year and a day to that time. It's now nearly midwinter, a few hours shy. You must put your head upon the block, and I will chop your head off the way we said." And of course, Gawain has promised. An oath is an oath. A knight's word is a knight's word. And rather probably shitting himself, but with the girdle on, he puts his head on the block, and the knight brings the axe down, and it makes a tiny little cut in the back of Gawain's neck. And the knight, with all the precision of a samurai warrior, takes the axe away and says, "Ha ha ha ha, you have been honourable in all things," the sharing of the kissing and everything else, except, of course, that silly girdle you've got on, which is not a magic girdle at all. That was just a test. Had you given me the girdle, you wouldn't even have that little nick. I would have stopped the blade short of your neck entirely. But because you were a bit naughty with the girdle, that's why you've got a little nick in the back of your neck as a reminder that a knight's word should always be honoured. And Gawain is besides himself with embarrassment, and all very kind of medieval courtly knight. So, "Oh, I have dishonoured myself," and lots of melodrama. And the knight says, "No, absolutely not. I mean, you were 99% there. I've never met a man as honourable as a 99% one as you. So I am amazed and impressed, and you will be duly rewarded," and so forth. But Gawain ends the story with a bit of hair shirt self-flagellation, thinking, "Oh, if only I'd gone the other 1% and given him the girdle, then my honour would be intact." So there's lots of kind of ladling on of imagery there, with the hawk of summer meeting this midwinter figure of the shambling giant, and a lot of modern day pagan writers have gone down that kind of Oak King, Holly King argument of Gwalchnared, the Hawk of Summer, and this strange shambling giant who is a figure of the winter. And is this a turning point? Personally, not a line I find very useful as an argument, but it's popular with a lot of people. The story is very much about honour and testing of honour and loyalty, and there's an almost identical story in Ireland with Cuchulainn, who again encounters a giant, scruffy old giant, who says to the three supposedly boldest warriors in Ireland, who will put their head on the block and face up to me, you cut my head off, I'll come back, cut your head off, etc., etc. And two of the biggest, boldest warriors in Ireland chop the giant's head off, and the giant picks his chopped off head up and walks out. And when he comes back, those two supposedly bravest warriors in Ireland leg it. They're too frightened to face him. The only one who's brave enough to face him is Cuchulainn, who puts his head on the chopping block, and the knight does exactly the same, or the giant rather, does exactly the same thing in the Irish story as the Green Knight does in the medieval English Welsh story. I.e. does not chop Cuchulainn's head off, but instead says, well, you've gone through it, you put your head on the block, stop the axe a millimetre above your neck, you are the bravest and the boldest and the best, because those other two pilchards shit themselves and ran off. Therefore you are the most honourable warrior in Ireland. So it's near identical story. And the Cuchulainn story is older in its written format than the Gawain and the Green Knight story, which has led most historians to suggest perhaps the Irish story came over with Irish merchants and travellers and what have you, monks and so on, and was heard of in Wales and Britain, sort of in England, Britain in general, did the rounds as a story, and eventually was committed to writing in the form of the Gawain and the Green Knight story. Or you could go down a more archetypal route, mythical route, and say this is a central image that crops up again and again in a number of different cultures, without necessarily a kind of direct connection, but it's a spontaneously developed story about testing your bravery, living up to your word, not being daft enough to make unwise oaths in the first place. Bit of a salutary underlying issue there in those two stories. But that if you do give your word, you must follow it through, and if you chicken out at the last minute, then you're not worth a tuppenny bit. But you should always go through with it no matter what. And you can read in lots of other meanings to those stories, which are worth discussing some other time. But the idea that the hawk is this courageous, brave, forceful character who literally puts his neck on the line, and always lives up to his word, or at least damn well strives to. So again, if you were thinking of divinatory readings, it could be about someone's sense of honour and living up to their word and not making unwise promises and pledges in the first place. Putting their neck on the line for their own reputation and the good of others, and protecting others and so forth. The third of the word arms I mentioned, activity of bees. During springtime, the willow tree with all the catkins on it is very, very popular with bees coming looking for pollen, making honey and so forth. So hence that. You can also read into that, obviously bees are a communal species by and large. You do get solitary bees, but the majority of bees are communal species. They all pull together in the hives, they look after each other. They're very industrious, so you can bring in ideas and imageries of industriousness and commitment and devotion and so on to that whole kind of realm and area. There is one interpretation, because different linguists translate things differently, which suggests a better translation would be beginning of honey, which again fits with that activity of bees, beginning of honey, collecting of pollen, putting in the work now in springtime when it's all jolly and lovely to store up for the winter ahead. So forethought, planning, preparation. If you're thinking in terms of more ritualistic uses, chanting as a mantra, that kind of thing, that could be used in conjunction with some sort of ritual where people are thinking about making oaths, giving their oaths, trying to think wisely and sensibly about the oaths that they're going to give and make, because they've got to follow through on them. That we need, as a culture, to return to a period in time in which a person, man or woman's oath is their word, and certainly hold our leaders accountable, and not just have these blathering tosspots who promise the earth and deliver absolutely nothing time and time and time again without ever being held accountable for their dishonesty or their unreliability. So if we all start that, then you create a bit of a ripple out that we can all be people of our word, people who make pledges and then follow through on them, rather than just kind of spouting nonsense for the sake of it and then never doing a damn thing to follow up on any of the promises that are made. I think, time-wise, I've rambled on quite long enough on that, but it's hopefully given you a few ideas to reflect on and something to come back to later. Thank you.